Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of the new Samyang AF 24mm f1.8 lens for Sony FE. Now, Samyang did have an existing 24mm lens. That lens, which is smaller than this lens, is only an f2.8 maximum aperture. And so in many ways, they are kind of modernizing this focal length to be comparable to some of the other choices that we have in what they call their tiny series, which now includes the 18mm f2.8, the 35mm f1.8, the 45mm f1.8, and the 75mm f1.8. And in many ways, I think that this is probably the best of the bunch thus far in terms of being a complete package. Autofocus, features, and then image quality performance. This really is a pretty fantastic little lens, and one that I have been anticipating its arrival and also excited to share with you, because I think that this is a really worthy consideration. A month or so ago, I did a review of the Viltrox 24mm f1.8, a lens that is similar in concept and similar in price. And while there is maybe a little bit of give and take, the Viltrox has a little bit more metal in its construction. The Samyang has a lot more going on for it on a lot of levels. We'll explore that together today. Now today I'm going to be doing the definitive review, jumping into various aspects of performance, specifically into the optical performance in great detail. And if you want a quicker, more overview type review, you can check out my standard review instead. I want to thank the sponsor of today's episode, which is Ridge Wallets, and I particularly am loving their new Damascus steel design, and I want to thank them for being a faithful supporter of this channel. Today's episode is brought to you by Ridge, the wallet redefined. Give your aching rear a break and ditch that bulky old wallet full of stuff you don't need and move to a sleek aluminum, titanium, carbon fiber, or even their new 18-karat gold Ridge wallet. It takes up little more room than a credit card, has RFID blocking technology to protect your valuable information, and comes with a lifetime warranty. Visit ridge.com/Dustin and use code Dustin to get 10% off your order, along with free shipping worldwide. So we're going to start by taking a look at the build and the handling of this lens, and Samyang has been continuing to evolve the feature set in these lenses. First of all, we saw the custom switch that allowed you to use the manual focus ring for a couple of different purposes, including aperture control, which I really appreciated that. And then they added, in the 35mm, they added weather sealing into the mix, which is we've got here. But now they've added a focus hold button along with a completely unique function for Samyang, in that if you hold down the button and power on the camera at the same time, it'll automatically focus to infinity and put you into manual focus mode. But focusing to infinity where it's properly calibrated, at least in my experience, for shooting astrophotography. And they are definitely marketing this lens as a great option for astrophotography, and we'll explore whether or not that's justified. But I did find, number one, that it worked, and that if I utilized that feature, I could then compare this image to an image where I manually focused to, as I typically would for shooting astrophotography, and I found that it was already perfectly focused. And there are instructions for if you need to make a minor tweak to calibration, if there's some variance in your camera body, there is a protocol for doing that. So a really cool feature here outside of the normal function of the focus hold button, which can be programmed to various functions in your camera body. There is that unique Samyang feature, which is a really, really cool one. Let's take a closer look at the other features of the lens itself. These tiny series lenses come with very nice cases that are molded and nicely sized and are certainly useful as well. Samyang has really stepped up the overall build and design of this particular lens. Now, it is still a largely plastic shell that is based around a metal mount and some metal internal parts, and so it's not going to necessarily feel premium in the hand, but really the tiny series has been about being lightweight, and it excels on that point, being only 230 grams or 8.1 ounces. The dimensions are also nice and compact. It's about 71.5 millimeters in length and 65 millimeters in diameter. So that makes it slightly larger than some of the other lenses in the series, fairly comparable in size to the 75 millimeter f1.8, which is on the right here. The filter thread is 58 millimeters, and I'm happy to see that 4 out of the 5 lenses that I featured here share that 58 millimeter filter size. And it's not that I want them to be slavish to that diameter, but it does certainly help when you can share filters across multiple lenses. As noted, Samyang has continued to evolve the feature set of these lenses, and this is the most robust yet of any Samyang lens that I've tested. And so that you have the custom mode, so it can be programmed depending on position to different functions, and some of the basic ones being that you can program it to manual focus, to where it automatically switches into manual focus when in that position, or you can have a custom mode 2, as I have it set up here, where it controls aperture, and so the focus ring now becomes an aperture ring while in that setting. My only complaint there is that there is no ability to control the direction of the rotation, so I find that I tend to go the wrong direction when trying to change aperture. It's just not logical for me, and that most aperture rings rotate to the left when you're trying to stop them down. This one, you go to the right if you want to stop the lens down. The focus hold button is a new addition, and obviously that has an extra layer of functionality, as mentioned, when it comes to shooting astrophotography. Our minimum focus distance here is 19 centimeters, or right over a half foot. That allows you to get nice and close and have a 0.21 times amount of magnification. There are 9 aperture blades inside, and it does a okay but not exceptional job of maintaining a circular aperture shape as you stop the lens down. So while the lens is still overall, as I said, largely plastics, it does have a gasket at the lens mount along with a total of 5 different seal points, and so at the switches either side of the ring here, and so that actually gives it a fairly professional grade of weather sealing, even though it's relatively inexpensive and small and compact. And so, as I noted earlier on, I think that they've done a great job of continuing to evolve this particular series. And I do want to applaud them in that rather than saying we have a blueprint that we have to slavishly, stick to because we started off designing these lenses in this series in a certain way, they've made room for growth. And the series, as a result, has gotten better and better as a byproduct of that. That's true also when we talk about autofocus, to where this is, I believe, probably the best execution of autofocus I've yet seen on a Samyang lens. Let's take a closer look. So initially, Samyang developed exclusively manual focus lenses, and about 4 or 5 years ago, they started to develop their first autofocus lenses, and the first ones that I reviewed were a little bit rough around the edges. And so I've watched them continue to evolve in their ability to produce quality autofocus over time. And one of the things that I have both praised and criticized for in the past is that they do allow you to get firmware updates, and they actually firmware update their lenses if you have the lens station. So that's one negative. You do need to have the lens station to accomplish that. But one of the things that was kind of the downside of that is that though they were great at doing firmware updates and kind of continuing to develop the quality of the lenses and their performance on the fly, I criticized them because sometimes it felt like lenses came to market a little bit unfinished, as if they were still kind of in beta mode and not quite to, their production release standard that they should be at. But fortunately, they have taken that advice to heart, and while I'm thankful to be able to have firmware updating capabilities, which kind of future-proofs your lenses, now you're able to get a lens right out of the box that performs really great on the autofocus front. And I've had nothing but good to say about the autofocus here. It helped a lot a few years back when they began to switch to linear STM motors. And so linear motors are just so much better for mirrorless performance. They tend to be much smoother, quieter, faster in operation if they're executed properly. And Samyang is really doing that. In this case, we have got a very well executed lens. And for example, if we do this test here where I begin to approach the camera and it tries to track the face, I found that I did at the same time in the same setting, I tested the Sony 35mm F1.8 G Master. G Master was a little bit better, but not by much. And so it did a really good job of tracking my face, as you can see, and moving with focus appropriately. I also, I'm filming on it right now to give you an idea of testing here on the Alpha 1. And so I've also filmed like a devotion episode for my church, about 12 minutes long. And over the course of that, I watched very carefully while I was editing, and I saw only one split-second moment where focus was not perfect, where it shifted off my face, kind of a very brief defocus, like I said, split second. It was the only time that that happened, which is really good for, number one, a wide-angle lens. And I also happened to be filming outdoors, which I'd like to be today, but it is doing the late spring winter mix where you get both snow and rain and all of that. Not very good conditions for outside. But I was actually filming on that day, and it was really blustery and windy, and behind me the background was constantly moving. Lots of motion to catch the attention of the focus, and yet it was really solid in that kind of situation. Let's take a look at video focus pulls and draw a few conclusions from that as well. So lots of great there. You could see, number one, that focus pulls were nice and confident, no settling, no adjusting. It just went and got to where it needed to be. There was nothing to hear other than Loki scampering around on the ground, and the fact that that's all you could hear and nothing from the focus motor tells you what you need to know when it comes to focus quality. You may have seen from that there is definitely a bit of focus breathing, and so it's not necessarily exceptional in that regard, though it's not bad either. And so overall, as you can see, for both video purposes, that we've got very nice autofocus. I also noticed the same to be true when it came to just generalized stills use, where focus was just excellent. I have no complaints, literally none. Whether it was shooting pet IAF, as you can see in this image, it just, even though Loki's moving around, detail on the eye, it's done a great job of tracking him, and at the moment of capture, focus was where it needed to be. Likewise, in a short portrait session, you can see that the results are just exceptional. It did what it needed to do in tracking the eye and delivering perfectly focused results. And so, as you've probably also seen from this segment, it's done a good job of tracking my face, and if anything that I've seen in the past holds true in this segment, it's done a great job of being consistent. So that can give you some assurance on autofocus front that if you're looking for a lens and maybe concerned about third-party autofocus, hopefully this has helped to allay some of those concerns. And obviously, at least at the state of the current firmware of lenses, it was a much more stable platform for capturing video like this than what was the Viltrox AF 24mm F1.8 STM that did quite a bit of hunting in a similar type situation. So a lot of great things there. Autofocus, build is all performing, the amount of features that are here. I really think that this is a lens that increasingly can compete on merit. And that is obviously great progress for Samyang lenses, whose former reputation was more that you got a budget lens that had surprisingly good optics for the cost of the lens. The price of the lens is still very, very good, but now it can compete on its merit. And that's true even when we talk about the image quality. Let's go into a deep dive of the performance of the image quality from this compact little lens. So we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. So at f1.8, you can see that there is a moderate amount of barrel distortion that is there. You can also see that there's just the tiniest bit of non-linear distortion, and you can see it really more after correction, and that there is a little tiny dip through this range that, and again on this side, not bad, however, and a much less complex distortion pattern than what we saw on the Viltrox 24mm f1.8. So it corrects reasonably well, obviously, and will correct better still when we're able to get a profile. I will note on the profile front that I do find that Samyang lenses don't always get perfect correction in camera on Sony, and so I would like to see that improved a little bit as well. But fortunately, nothing here is too complex or obvious to really destroy many real-world images. I used a +8 on the Lightroom slider to correct over here. For the vignette, which is, again is also moderate, I used a +48 that tells me that's right under 2 stops of correction. And I moved the midpoint all the way over to 0 to give us a nice linear correction. So it corrects fairly easily, if not flawlessly. So let's take a look at aberrations. For lateral chromatic aberrations, which would exhibit as purple and green fringing or blue fringing on either side of, like black and white transitions, you basically don't see anything here. And so it's doing a great job of controlling lateral CA, which is important in a wide-angle lens that tends to capture things along the periphery where that can really show up. So nothing but good on that front. When it comes to longitudinal chromatic aberrations, that would be magenta fringing before the plane of focus and green fringing afterward. Almost none of the magenta fringing here, that's well controlled. A bit more of the green fringing after the plane of focus, but again, not terribly pronounced. And so a good job of controlling aberrations, and you can see from our contrast here that the blacks are nice and inky even at f1.8. So how does that translate into resolution and contrast on our chart here? I will point out this is being done on a Sony Alpha 1, and so a 50 megapixel sensor. We can see, looking in the center of the frame, that we have got an impressive amount of both resolution and contrast here. There's a lot of fine details that are being rendered there. It looks great. If we move off to the mid frame, we can also see a great result with a lot of acuity, nice rendering of fine details, and even down into the corner. We've got very nice resolution going all the way down into the very corner. This is a very impressive wide-angle performance, and I think possibly the best performance that we've seen on any of Samyang's tiny lenses in general. So how does that compare to the recent Viltrox 24mm F1.8? Well, at least on the copies that I tested here, you can see that the Samyang is head and shoulders above. It is resolving everything much better, has better contrast. We look at the mid frame. The Viltrox doesn't lose much moving to the mid frame, but it's not going to compared to the Samyang. And down in the corners, it's maybe a little bit closer here, but you can see that as far as the actual acuity, rendering those fine details and contrast, the Samyang is an easy winner. I was impressed enough by that performance that I wanted to reach back into my catalog and see how it compared to what I have considered to be one of the best wide-angle primes on Sony. That's the FE 20mm f1.8 G lens from Sony. Now, one caveat, the G lens was tested on the 42 megapixel Sony a7R Mark III, slightly less resolution, but not enough to drastically change the outcome here. And what we can see is that I was surprised to see this. The Samyang is actually sharper in the center of the frame, and noticeably sharper, giving a stronger performance. In the mid frame, the same is true. It is noticeably sharper, better contrast, and even down into the edge, where I think that the Sony closes the gap a bit. But I would still give the nod to the Samyang for a better overall performance. I'm surprised by that. So how far could I take that? I had the Sony 35mm f1.4 G Master lens on hand, and I thought, well, might as well give it a shot to see if it can compare. I did both of them at f1.8 on the Alpha 1. Well, the G Master is the winner, as you would expect and as is proper. You can see that the Samyang certainly doesn't embarrass itself, but the G Master has better contrast and slightly better resolution. We can see in the mid frame that continues to be true. The G Master looks great there. And into the corner, the G Master also has a slight edge, though it's not, night and day. But the Samyang, I think, is as close to the G Master, or closer to the G Master, I would say, than it was to the 20mm f1.8 G. And so that is really, really impressive. So how does that translate into real-world images? Well, Loki, he likes to move at this stage, but nonetheless, I managed to catch him here at f1.8, and you can see it's rendering all kinds of fine details on the fur and the detail around the eye, looking really fantastic. If I shot in a portrait setting, wide open, you can see that if we zoom into a pixel level, there is a great amount of detail around the eyes and across the skin textures. It looks really fantastic. Out into a real-world image here at f1.8, we can see that if we zoom into this sign, which was the focal point, you can see that all of those textures, there's just tons of information that is there. So this is a very usable amount of real-world sharpness here. So the question arises, when a lens is this good wide open, does it have more left in the tank as you stop it down? Well, we can see that surprisingly, even at a 1/3 stop down to f2, already our contrast is noticeably higher. And that's true if we look into the mid frame. Also, if we look down into the corner, we can see that there's an improvement in that overall contrast and detail, even at that tiny bit of stop down. Stopping down to f2.8 provides a noticeable jump in overall performance, which becomes very, very impressive. And even from f2.8 to f4, there is a mild further improvement in terms of contrast to where now all of those textures are just really leaping off the page. So I thought I'd check back in with the 20mm f1.8G here, both of them at f4. And you can see that in the center of the page, the contrast from the G lens looks quite good. It looks more comparable on the contrast level, but there's still a bit of an advantage in the amount of texture information being rendered by the Samyang lens. And that's also true here. And if we pop down into the corners, we can see that it's mild, but there still is a mild advantage for the Samyang. There is a mild further improvement to f5.6, and everything looks really, really great for landscape type apertures. But let's just check back in with the comparison to the Viltrox now. So the Viltrox is looking better in terms of contrast and detail, looking quite good, but not to the level that we see from the Samyang. That is just giving us more rendering of fine details, and I think a little more even rendering and performance there. And so, you know, the Viltrox is still quite good at small apertures, as we saw in the review of that lens, but the Samyang is better still. This translates into real-world images, where, as you can see in this landscape image, the detail is really great across the frame. And all those needles, lots of fine details that are resolved there. And if we, you know, pan across to here, it's true on this side as well. Into the foreground, just lots and lots of texture information. Very, very impressive. I also found that the contrast translated into monochrome images very well, which not every lens does, in my opinion. And so you can see here that, you know, where it matters, everything looks really, really crisp. Very, very nice results there. In this situation, I had a nice flat, you know, plane of focus if I focused down. And so you can see in these fallen leaves that everywhere we look in this image, if we look here towards the center, I mean, it's resolving so much information there. Down into the very, very corner, you can just see that right along the edges of the frame, it's basically the exact same here at f5.6. It just looks fabulous across the frame. We do have a useful minimum focus distance and maximum magnification here, and so that allows us to get nice and close and to have a high level of magnification, 0.21 times, which is much better than anything we've previously seen in this tiny series. Also unsurprising, though, is that when you get that close with a wide-angle lens, you tend to not have a particularly flat plane of focus. And that's true here. That mild amount of barrel distortion, or moderate amount, means that it's just enough to where if you're focused in the center, the sides begin to fall off and it's not focused very flatly there. But we do see that in the plane of focus, both contrast and detail look quite good. And so that allows us to have some versatility when, you know, shooting up close in real world situations. This image, for example, shows that if you look in close at the detail, that everything is looking quite good, no marring from chromatic aberrations, and it's rendering those fine details everywhere really quite nicely. The bokeh in this particular image is also quite nice. I'll also quickly note that I was impressed with the color levels. I did a lot of side-by-side shooting with a couple of G Master lenses that I happened to be testing at the latter part of the same time of this review, including the 35mm f1.4 G Master and the 14mm f1.8, and colors were not dissimilar. And so the Samyang images look like they fit in terms of the overall color. And you can see here, just beautiful, rich color, not oversaturated, not garish. It just looks really, really nice and natural. And so I was really quite pleased with images, and this was a favorite of mine. I like the lighting and the contrast, and the colors of the image just looked really, really beautiful. And so kudos to them. Sometimes Samyang has a reputation for having slightly warm rendering. I didn't find that to be true here. I found that colors were very accurate. Now, bokeh in terms of the aperture shape is a little less impressive. What I noted when looking at the physical aperture is that it wasn't quite circular. It's a little bit lopsided, and that bears out a bit in these bokeh highlights. They also have a little bit more outlining than what you would like, and so that's going to keep things from being perfectly soft. You can see as we stop down that the aperture shape, you can tell, is just a little uneven, and so it's elongated just a little bit. And so, you know, you can start to see the blades after it stopped down a bit, but you can also see that it's not perfectly even. So we noted that the bokeh in this image was quite good, but in some situations it's a little more busy. As you can see here, we could get fairly close to the subject, but the bokeh before and then into that transition zone has a little bit more outlining than what I would like. Likewise here, it's not bad as you begin to transition on here. It looks fairly good up here, but the outlining shows up these kind of bare branches a little bit more than what I would like. I'm maybe being a little overly critical because it is a wide-angle lens, but there are situations where it does quite a good job. This image, for example, I think looks, you know, fairly artful in its overall rendering. And, you know, once again, I'm really impressed by the combination of the detail in this area and then the amount of, you know, blur in the background. This image in particular stands out as looking really nice and softer, and it's because the ratio is favorable. I'm very close to the subject. This was a tiny little shoot coming out of the ground. But then because it allows the background to be further away, the bokeh is nice and soft. And so as with any lens like this, it doesn't do all the work for you. You have to use the lens wisely to get the best images out of it in this situation. Here's one more that I thought was quite nice, and once again, our amount of detail on our subject looks really, really magnificent. And then the autofocus area looks, you know, fairly good, and the fact that you can get close helps. This was one that I thought was a little bit on the busy side, and so just to show you, you know, both sides of the coin there. Flare resistance was fairly good, though not exceptional. Certainly the G Masters in this situation, both of them showed no kind of ghosting artifact at all. Their coatings are fantastic now. Not as favorable here, primarily because of this ghosting blob that you can see here in this image. But fortunately, that was the worst that I saw in my test. And in this image, for example, I couldn't find any kind of ghosting artifacts here. It looks nice. And you can also get a look at the sunburst effect. So overall, it was fairly good, though not exceptional in flare resistance. Finally, Samyang markets this lens as an astrophotography lens, as we've talked about previously, and so let's see if that claim bears up. In the center of the frame, everything looks fantastic, and by the way, I used their automatic focusing to this using the focus hold button with the camera powered off, and it gave me perfect nighttime focus. So star points look great there. Off to the side, there is a mild bit of deforming of the circular shapes, but they are still largely circular, no real kind of big wings growing or anything. And so as you get to the corner, there's a little bit of stretching, but overall, this is quite a good result, even at f1.8. And so I would say that it does live up to the billing, that it's producing a good coma result, and it is a very positive choice for astrophotography. So at the end of the day, I think that Samyang has done a fantastic job with this lens optically. It is, in my opinion, the best of the bunch of the tiny series that we have seen thus far. So we've still got a lens that can fit into the palm of my hand and yet has a very, very strong optical performance that I am surprised at how good it is and what kind of lenses that it can compete with. So at the end of the day, with a lens that retails for right under $500 US, it's a lens that's bringing a great deal of value to the table. 24mm is not a radically wide focal length, obviously, but I've seen and reviewed enough 24mm lenses to know that it can be a difficult focal length still to engineer for. But Samyang has nailed this particular lens. No, it's still largely plastics. It's not going to feel premium in your hand, but in where it counts, there's lots of good stuff here. Good weather sealing, great autofocus, a nice little amount of features. And this is a lens, because it is so small and lightweight, only 230 grams, it's not going to be a lens that you're going to hesitate to put into your bag or even into your pocket if you're carrying another lens mounted on your camera. And so you have this focal length available. And that really gives it an extra layer of value that a larger, heavier lens does not. And it's part of why I think that the Samyang Tiny series is one of the great advantages that Sony has relative to other platforms. I'm not aware of any other such series on other platforms where you can get both small, light, inexpensive, but also very optically strong. So kudos to Samyang for really giving Sony a great option and advantage on their platform. And if you've wanted a lens around this focal length and your budget doesn't go as far as the 24mm F1.4 G Master, which is a fantastic lens, obviously, but you can get this lens for about 2.5 times less, even slightly more than that. And so, I mean, that obviously makes it a really fantastic value for a lot of you that are watching this right now. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review, also to an image gallery. Check out photos from the lens. There are buying links that are there as well, and of course, linkage to follow me on social media, to become a patron, to purchase some of the merch if you're looking for that. Also, sign up for my newsletter. It comes out every Thursday, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Be sure to ring that bell to get notifications when new content drops. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.